US Marines and paratroopers are sailing to the Persian Gulf region. What started as a devastating series of airstrikes in Operation Epic Fury is starting to look like the seeds of a ground campaign. The US is setting up for a ground invasion of Iran, and Iran's regime absolutely isn't ready. The ground invasion will change everything, and what happens next will be unbelievable. The incoming forces to Iran certainly indicate that a ground invasion is coming. The Telegraph reports that the US has sent around 2,000 soldiers from the elite 82nd Airborne Division to the Gulf, and that they're currently en route and will be ready to step into action if negotiations with Iran break down. They're being joined by similar numbers of US Marines from both the 31st and the 11th Marine Expeditionary Units, or MEUs, the former of which should be arriving in the Persian Gulf region at some point toward the end of March. These are all units that specialize in ground operations, with the Marine Expeditionary Units in particular often being the first to head in when the US launches a ground invasion. They served that role in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and the signs are starting to suggest they may do something similar in Iran as the US amasses a force of more than 6,000 elite soldiers around Tehran. All signs are pointing toward boots being put on the ground. Now that will change everything for Iran, and the regime knows it. That's why we're starting to see some major signs of desperation from Iran's regime mingling with attempts to prepare for the possibility that it will have to deal with US soldiers on its territory sooner rather than later. Kharg Island offers the clearest signs of these preparations, along with a clue about one of the 4 ways we believe the US might choose to attack Iran by ground. According to the Jerusalem Post and CNN, Iran's regime is hurriedly trying to fortify Kharg Island in anticipation of the US deploying its MEUs and paratroopers on the island. The former reported on March 26th that Iran has been busy laying traps all over the island, and that it has moved both military personnel and air defenses to the rocky little outcrop that plays a crucial role in the Iranian oil lifeline that is helping to keep the country's regime in power. And CNN says much the same thing, while also noting that around 90% of Iran's oil exports run through this one island, so the regime has a very clear desire to protect it. Without Kharg, the oil money stops flowing, and the Strait of Hormuz becomes vulnerable. Anti-armor and anti-personnel mines are among the traps being laid on the island, CNN reports, with many of these mines reportedly being used to lace the shorelines that a US amphibious landing would inevitably have to negotiate. Iran's challenge with Kharg Island is that much of the military infrastructure that already existed on the vital island has been destroyed in US airstrikes. And what we see on the island now is a desperate attempt to bolster a military force that the US claims has already been shattered. On March 13th, the US totally obliterated the island's military facilities, US President Donald Trump claimed. Among what Iran lost on that day were missile storage bunkers and naval mine storage facilities, both of which would be vital in any defense that Iran tries to mount against America's amphibious forces. Air defenses, a helicopter hangar, and an airport control tower were also reportedly targeted in an attack clearly designed to cripple the Iranian military presence on Kharg Island, perhaps ahead of the US putting the boots currently heading toward the Persian Gulf region on the ground on that island. But that's just one possibility. There are others that we'll get to, but Iran's desperation is also showing in how it's approaching negotiations with the US that could bring an end to Operation Epic Fury. It's not clear if these negotiations are even happening, as the US claims that they are, while Iran says that the US is negotiating with itself, followed by its regime claiming that it has no intention of negotiating right now. Now, these appear to be games being played by a regime that is very clearly worried that the US is about to take Operation Epic Fury to a new level, and Trump is clearly frustrated by it all. Taking to his Truth Social platform on March 26th, Trump declared, "The Iranian negotiators are very different and strange. They are begging us to make a deal, which they should be doing since they have been militarily obliterated, with zero chance of comeback, and yet they publicly state that they are only looking at our proposal. Wrong." Trump then added that Iran's regime better get serious soon before it is too late, because once that happens, there is no turning back, and it won't be pretty. Now, Iran can't receive a warning clearer than that, and as much as its regime is trying to act as though it is operating from a position of strength in negotiations that it claims aren't even happening, the fortification of Kharg Island is the telltale sign that it is very worried about what the US is sending its way right now. Over 6,000 Marines and paratroopers are coming, but what might happen next could catch everybody, especially Iran's regime, completely off guard. Kharg Island may not be the target for a ground invasion at all. In fact, attacking that island is only one of 4 potential approaches that the US could take as boots on the ground start to seem inevitable. The first scenario we're going to cover skips Kharg Island altogether. America's plan might be to deal with Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, rather than to weaken the regime with an assault on its oil facilities on Kharg Island. And to pull that off, the US would have to focus on the coastal regions in the strait, along with an entirely different island that is perhaps as strategically important to Iran as Kharg Island, but for a different reason: enabling its Hormuz blockade. If this is indeed the plan, there are good reasons why the US would want to execute on it. Iran's Hormuz blockade has essentially closed a waterway through which about 20% of the world's oil, much of it from Gulf countries that aren't allied with Iran, flows. Iran is believed to have mined the shipping lanes established in that strait, and its blockade has resulted in oil prices jumping up to around $100 per barrel. Now, key to this blockade is the asymmetric approach that Iran has taken. Iran isn't sending warships into the Strait of Hormuz. They would be easy targets for America's overwhelming air power. Instead, Iran is using a combination of drones, anti-ship missiles, and fast boats to make crossing the Strait of Hormuz a very dangerous prospect for any merchant ship that would typically have used the waterway. And this is where the US ground forces come into play. Iran is able to exercise so much control in the Strait of Hormuz because its coast runs the entire 100-mile length of the waterway. And along that coast are hidden missile launch sites and makeshift ports that enable Iran's asymmetric approach. So what we could see from the US is the landing of its Marines, or perhaps airdrops of paratroopers who are tasked with taking out or holding key military nodes on the Strait of Hormuz coast, thus taking away Iran's ability to use those nodes in its blockade. And then comes the island that we mentioned earlier. Now, Keshem is an island that overlooks the Strait of Hormuz. It's the largest of the many islands that are in the Persian Gulf region. Though at about 130 kilometers, or around 80.7 miles long, it's certainly vulnerable to a ground campaign. Now, you might wonder why the US would even bother though, given that Keshem is more known for its lush foliage and wildlife, which is why Iran applied for it to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site back in 2007. But behind the popular tourist destination lurks secrets that Iran doesn't want anybody to know about. Now, according to The Telegraph, hidden deep beneath the salt caves and mangrove forests that have for so long made Keshem a tourist hotspot is an underground missile city where Iran has stockpiled weapons that include the types of anti-ship munitions it has been using to target merchant ships in the Strait of Hormuz. And some of the tunnels in this missile city go as deep as 1,600 feet. So Iran's weapons are hiding away on an island that is perfectly positioned to aid in the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. And for the US, a ground operation on that island would be a huge help when it comes to solving the Hormuz problem. Preceded by airstrikes, the 82nd Airborne Division could land paratroopers on Keshem, where they would seize military nodes and raid the tunnel network that Iran has built under the island. Combine that with MEU assaults against coastal military nodes, along with A-10 strafing runs over the Strait of Hormuz itself, and the US may have a military answer to the Hormuz problem. So that's one potential approach in terms of what comes next when America's ground forces arrive in the Persian Gulf region. But the next is a little more nebulous and certainly doesn't have the sort of direct route to victory that we see in this first strategy. But before we get to that, this is a quick reminder that you're watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to hit that button. So, second on the list of possibilities is that the US starts deploying special forces operatives for targeted missions inside Iran, which could extend to the destruction of military nodes or even the capturing of key personnel. And that's according to Ehud Ilam, who is a former official in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Though Ilam notes that securing the Strait of Hormuz seems like the most logical step for the US. They may come and capture a certain objective, destroy some Iranian radar or some Iranian facility, take some generals into captivity. Now, the difference in this approach would be that the US would be focused on further degrading Iran's military capabilities, rather than attempting to capture and hold positions. Small operations teams could certainly play a role here, and on the leadership extraction point, we've seen the US pull off those kinds of operations in the very recent past. It was only in January that American special forces took Venezuela's former president, Nicolas Maduro, into custody with an extraction operation that penetrated deep into the heart of Caracas. So, the US has the capabilities to capture leaders. Now, whether the MEUs and paratroopers it's sending to Iran do is another question. Neither type of unit is designed for that purpose, though paratroopers could indeed help with degrading military nodes, perhaps in preparation for follow-on airstrikes. You also have to consider how useful the extraction of any of Iran's leaders would be at this point. Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion already took out former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei during the first day of the war with Iran, and dozens more military officials and political figures have been eliminated in the days since. Now, perhaps an argument could be made that extracting an Iranian leader, such as Ali Khamenei's son and new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, could give the US some leverage in negotiations. But it seems just as likely that Iran will continue on with a fractured leadership, just as it has been throughout Operation Epic Fury. Now, some isolated strikes against military nodes inside Iran are a possibility. Extracting leaders, perhaps less so, especially with the types of forces that the US is sending to the Persian Gulf region. And that brings us to the third option, which in turn brings us back to Kharg Island. Now, we've already touched on the benefits of putting boots on the ground in Kharg Island. It's an island, for starters, which is perfect territory for MEUs and can be targeted by paratroopers who are dropped into key positions on Kharg. Plus, there's the 90% of Iran's oil exports issue. If the US can take control of the island's oil facilities, it will choke Iran's economy, which in turn gives it leverage that can be used to force the lifting of the Strait of Hormuz blockade. Or it'll just bankrupt the Iranian regime, forcing capitulation. Either option would be fine for the US. Now, an invasion of Kharg Island is also very much possible. Former CENTCOM commander Joseph Fotel tells the Warzone, "I would imagine on a little island like Kharg, a battalion-sized force of Marines or soldiers could probably do that. So you're probably looking at 800 to 1,000 troops kind of size, maybe a little bit smaller, probably not much larger than that," Votel claims. Again, this is very much MEU territory, and if Votel is correct, the US wouldn't even need the full force of the 2 MEUs that it's sending to Iran to take Kharg Island. However, taking Kharg Island isn't the issue. The real problem is this: holding on to that island that is just 20 miles or so from the Iranian coast and would be a sitting duck for missile launchers and other types of attacks from the Iranian mainland. The Atlantic points out that this proximity to Iran, combined with the fact that the nearest friendly base is about 140 miles away, causes issues. It could put America's ground forces in a position where they're trying to hold Kharg Island while they're constantly under attack and dealing with resupply missions that would inherently carry a lot of risk. Drones and missiles would fly constantly, and logistical support would be difficult for the US to provide as quickly as needed. Still, these are problems that can be solved, especially if the US forms a blockade around the island and transports enough air defenses to secure it as best as possible against the Iranian response. If America manages that, the juice could be worth the squeeze, as Iran's regime won't survive for very long, and the same goes for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, if it doesn't have access to the money generated by oil exports. Though Kharg Island seems like the clearest of the 3 options, based on the fact that the US has already hit its military facilities and has threatened to strike again, there is a 4th option: entering Iran and taking its uranium. Now, of the 4 options, this would be the most difficult, as it involves sending special forces deep into Iran to essentially take over the underground bunkers where Iran's enriched uranium is kept. That is far more than a destruction or extraction mission. The US would need to have enough soldiers in play to not only take the uranium sites, but to hold them against the inevitable Iranian counterattacks. As Votel points out, sites like Isfahan and Natanz are hundreds of miles inland and largely in open plain areas, which provide practically no terrain protection. A sizable force of anywhere between 1,000 and 4,000 troops would be needed to secure this kind of site long enough for the enriched uranium to be extracted. And the US would also need engineers and specialists who can conduct this extraction safely. Now, much like with the targeting of Iran's leaders, questions have to be asked about whether MEUs and paratroopers are built for this kinds of operations. They seem more like the preserve of Delta Force or the Navy SEALs, perhaps with support from MEUs and paratroopers. But who knows? Those sorts of special forces might already be on their way, and the US simply isn't telling anybody. What has been publicized so far could be for force projection, while secretive special forces units could also be en route to conduct the types of missions that the Marines and paratroopers that we know are heading to don't do. Now, if this is the route that the US takes, the big risks that come with it could also offer some big rewards. Iran's nuclear weapons program was a huge trigger for Operation Epic Fury. Though Iran isn't believed to have nuclear weapons capabilities right now, it's clearly working to put itself in a position where it could build a basic nuke. And that much is clear from the sheer size of the stockpile of enriched uranium that is in the country. According to the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, that stockpile amounts to 440.9 kilograms, or about 972 pounds of uranium that's been enriched up to 60% of the U-235 isotope. This is the explosive isotope that makes the types of nukes Iran would want to build possible. And worse yet, the center says Iran has already completed 99% of the work it needs to do to enrich its uranium further to hit the 90% of U-235 needed to build a nuclear weapon. Now, in other words, Iran says that it doesn't have a nuke and it may be telling the truth, but it could build one. And that's a problem that the US might look to solve by sending soldiers into Iran to extract as much of its enriched uranium as possible. This isn't a one-day operation for the US, though. It would need several days to package and extract Iran's uranium, and with that time comes the need to defend its troops as they do their work. Now, any of the four scenarios that we've presented here would change everything for Iran and Operation Epic Fury. That would represent the type of escalation that Iran's regime never expected, with each also being designed to strip Iran of key pieces of leverage it wants to use to keep itself alive in this fight. Losing Kharg Island means no more oil money. The US putting boots on the ground in the Strait of Hormuz and Keshem would be a problem for Iran's blockade strategy. If leaders are extracted, that gives the US more negotiating power. And the loss of its enriched uranium, which would likely be accompanied by the controlled destruction of centrifuges and other vital equipment, would cripple Iran's nuclear plans. All could push Iran closer to regime change too. Now, speaking to CBN News, former deputy commander of Israel's Sayeret Matkal Special Forces Unit, Doron Kempel, claims that there are likely generals in the IRGC who are frustrated and willing to defect. And he adds that both the US and Israel will have operatives on the ground working under deep cover to push these defections along. At the decisive moment, when the IRGC's collapse is imminent, these generals could rally their forces, link up with Mossad and CIA operatives, and ignite a full-scale internal revolution from within, Kempel tells CBN News. Perhaps US boots on the ground could provide that decisive moment. Now, if it does, Iran's regime won't be losing a key piece of leverage, no matter which of these options the US chooses. It would also be primed to lose the very seat of power that it has held for decades. And what seems almost certain is that the largest US ground invasion in Iran's history is about to go down, and it could change everything. We've mentioned America's MEUs several times already, and if you want to find out more about what they are and what they could do in Iran, then check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe as we track America's moves as it looks to transition to a ground-based phase of Operation Epic Fury.